Hi everyone, this is Dan, and this is the Amazing Spider-Man number 2. Sort of the last video I'm going to do on Spider-Man, or at least Stan Lee Spider-Man for a while. No, I don't have anything against Spider-Man. I just have a whole bunch of other videos that I really should be doing as well. Though I will say this, going through these first 3 issues, I say 3 because I'm considering Amazing Fantasy number 15 to be really the beginning of Spider-Man and the Legend of Spider-Man, I should say. This has been a lot of fun, and it's not always often when you go over old school comics that you really enjoy it this much. Like, I know I did the Discovering Green Lantern series, and the first couple issues of Green Lantern are like, they're okay. I mean, yeah, it sets the premise and it sets the world, but you could definitely tell that the storytelling was very dated and of the time. But Amazing Spider-Man and Amazing Fantasy, and really all of Stan Lee's old stuff, to this day holds up very, very well, and it's still really enjoyable to read. And it's a testament to Stan the man, dude. Like, now, is it, gonna be the greatest thing ever? Nah, I don't know necessarily with that, but it is certainly iconic. And it's, that I don't know where people get this idea that Stan Lee is like some hack or something. And honestly, I think it might just be some prejudice for his success or whatever the hell it is, or maybe you're just such a diehard, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko fan that you think, they were both wronged or something like that. But man, these books are these issues right here, and the art by Ditko is it's good. I wouldn't say like great or like amazing. His later stuff is much more, Ditko being Ditko. But these books are really held up by Stan Lee's storytelling and his vision for what this character should be and what Marvel ultimately became. Anyway, you get iconic cover right here. First appearance of the Vulture. 2 great stories, 2 great villains. This is back in the days when most of the issues from Marvel were basically double stories. Most of the issues from DC and other comic book creators at this time were essentially double stories, essentially anthologies, right? They were kind of... the comics of this era were still very, very closely related to the pulps of yesteryear. I think pulps were still going on even to this day, right? For those of you who don't know American literature history, Pulp Fiction, not the movie by Quentin Tarantino, but pulps were basically really raggedy magazines that contained several short story fiction, right? And they were typically of genres that were fantastic and out of this world. It was where Conan the Barbarian got his start, The Shadow, and was it Doc Savage, and what is it? God, I can't believe I forget his name. Flash Gordon. Many of the great classic stories of American fantasy, sci-fi, noir detective, and all kinds of other great fantastic genres that kind of made up the bulk of American fiction of the early 20th century came from the pulps. And American comic books likewise trace their lineage back to the pulp fiction of those days, and especially these early comics, they really do remind me very much of those pulp collections, especially in their structure and how compressed they are, and just how out of the world they tend to be in their creativity. Right? One of these days, I should do a pulp, just because they're very, very underrated, and I think a lot of people just forget about them because they're so old, which is unfortunate. Anyway, let's get into this. We get a great splash page right here, which is a lot of these, both these stories use like a splash page to sort of show Spider-Man in some dramatic pose fighting a dastardly villain, and Stan Lee basically uses it as sort of a teaser to try to jump you in, and then he goes into a more standard storytelling right here. And these, as you can tell, these images right here, the panels, aren't anything special. The layout isn't very unique, and the draftsmanship of Steve Ditko right here is, just effective, right? It's not particularly impressive. This Vulture panel is pretty cool, but for the most part, it's kind of glued together by the narration of Stan Lee and the sort of classic dialogue by characters right here. Some of this may not feel more cinematic, which is what people nowadays go for, but this is like the classic comic book dialogue that you have here, right? So we get the introduction. Vulture's going around committing crimes in New York City. JJ is screaming at all of his editors to make more articles about the Vulture, and also don't forget about Spider-Man. JJ just has a continual stick up his butt about Spider-Man. And of course, all the kids in the high school are also talking about these crimes going on right now in Now magazine. It's not the Daily Bugle, right? At this point in time. And Peter Parker's like, that's interesting. They're looking for photos of the Vulture. I could make some money. And this effectively is the beginning of the legend of Peter Parker as a reporter. It started from this story right here with the Vulture in the introduction. So Peter Parker kind of gets his get-rich scheme right here. It's like, wait a minute, I'm Spider-Man. I can fly around and take photos of myself and the Vulture and sell them for money right here. Because remember, this is still around the time when Peter Parker's trying to make money to pay for ends meet. You know, his aunt's in trouble. He's like selling off her jewelry and stuff. And Peter, being a responsible, good boy, he's trying to figure out a way to make money for the family right here. So, an introduction of the Vulture. Sort of, again, just classic Stan Lee, thought balloons everywhere. Love it. It's just classic American comic book storytelling right here. So he goes in, and he's kind of an arrogant little prick as he warns the police of his plan. Runs into Spider-Man while he's out there basically trying to fool the police and the newspapers and everything. Ends up throwing him in a water tank and trapping him in there. Spider-Man, not particularly happy about getting his butt kicked. Ends up escaping, grabs his camera, then kind of creates basically his game plan. This is also the invention of Spider-Man's utility belt. So again, Spider-Man's not like Batman. He keeps his utility belt under his costume. So Spider-Man is always drawn very sleek-like. And when he runs out of web fluid, he pulls it out of his utility belt underneath his costume. He also comes up with a little bit of a gadget, which ends up being a bit of a Deus Ex Machina later in the story, but we'll go into that later. So around this time, Peter Parker was able to get a photo, or I should say, Spider-Man was able to get a photo of the Vulture during that fight. He goes over to JJ, and of course, Peter Parker, being kind of a smart ass, he's figuring like, oh, this guy gives me so much grief in the newspaper as Spider-Man. Of course, I'll be the guy to sell photos to him and make money off of him, off these photos that I'm creating as Spider-Man, right? So you get over, and it's at the scene of the crime. The Vulture ends up tricking the police. You know, surprise, surprise. He runs off with the jewels. Spider-Man chases after him, and after some struggles up on the rooftop, he's able to basically disable the Vulture's weird, flight ability, which we find out later is a magnetic power. And what Spider-Man did was create a anti-magnetic inverter. Yeah, no, a little bit of a stretch here, Stan, but you remember, this was the 60s, so, sci-fi was, a little bit wacky in these times. People kind of come up with stuff. So, the Vulture ends up getting captured. He ends up selling pictures of himself and the Vulture getting captured to JJ for a shitload of money, which he then uses to pay off the rent for the year for his aunt, as well as a bunch of nice appliances, being a good boy. And the Vulture is thrown in jail, vowing for revenge against that accursed Spider-Man. Classic American comic book story. The other backup story in this particular issue is one about the Tinker, which basically involves Peter getting invited to go help out a professor with some lab experiments. He sends him over to the Tinker, who's fixing a radio for him, and basically Peter, through his spider senses, ends up finding out that there's something up with this Tinker and the radio that he just repaired. And when he goes to investigate, he finds out the Tinker's helping a bunch of aliens take over the Earth. And after some wild fights and beatdowns, he's able to sort of break up their operations. They end up escaping, but basically he's able to save the day and return to the professor. The professor being none the wiser of what's been going on right here. So a pretty, quick adventure, like a pretty good backup story. These were typically the backup stories of the era back then. A lot of like sci-fi and aliens and rocket stuff and people flying into space and stuff. A lot of times, like in this era, whenever they kind of ran out of ideas, they just kind of shot their superheroes into space to fight aliens, which is not a bad idea, especially since this is Marvel is based on the world outside your window, right? So the idea is like, well, if we ever run out of ideas in the real world, can't, Spider-Man, stopping a thief all the time isn't always interesting. So we'll have Spider-Man fight some aliens. So overall, great issue. By the way, next issue, of course, is the introduction of Doc Ock. But yeah, what's really important about issue number 2 is basically the continuation of who Peter Parker eventually becomes, right? So this is Peter Parker becoming the photographer for JJ, right? And secretly being JJ's, ultimate, and nemesis, which is Spider-Man, which is kind of like the fun aspect of Spider-Man, right? As you get further, it's like JJ never suspects that Peter Parker is the one selling him the photos, right? And this is not necessarily explained in every single version of Spider-Man. Like, for example, the Spider-Man animation from the 90s? Yeah, the 90s one on Fox. That one just immediately starts with Peter Parker being a photographer and everyone just knowing that Spider-Man, sells, or Peter Parker sells photographs of himself as Spider-Man to JJ, who's trying to expose Spider-Man. But the comic actually goes into detail and builds it up. And it seems kind of, just a point in history for the average reader. But you got to remember, like, back in the 60s, people were first getting introduced to this character. So nobody knew who Spider-Man was. It was just, the story was being written as it was going. And you can see here the underpinnings of a legendary franchise right here that would have, life for decades and decades and decades, honestly. Anyhow, that's the video, guys. Let me know what you think. Had a lot of fun going over Amazing Spider-Man, the early issues right here. Definitely will be doing more first issues. I think I'll probably be doing Fantastic Four. I might even do some more of the modern stuff. I think right now I'll probably be doing, at least in the Marvel realm, I'm probably going to be heading back over to X-Men for a little bit. And on the DC side, I'm probably going to be doing some Batman and Wonder Woman comics, just because I don't really have a ton of those on my channel, and I think it's kind of appropriate. I also will finish the New Teen Titans, by the way. That will happen, the Judas Contract. It's just, there's been so many crowdfunded comics lately, I've had a hard time coming back to the old school stuff. Anyhow, that's the video, guys. Let me know what you think. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Hit the bell for notifications. If you got any comments on the Amazing Spider-Man #2, leave it down below, and I will see you next time.